The most obvious one will be irrigation scheduling, based on if we can close the soil water balance, or if we know what is the current deficit of the soil, then we can try to compensate that deficit by applying, irrigation. There are other managements that we can do for, like in rain-fed agriculture, although the options are much more limited there. But, for instance, for deciding the timing of nitrogen application, let's say in winter wheat. So if it's in late February and you had to decide whether you want to apply another round of urea to winter wheat, depending on if it's looking good and you have moisture, maybe it's worth applying that nitrogen.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. My name is Brian Arnell, and I'm coming to you from Oklahoma State University. This show is brought to you on behalf of Wysenetics. Today, we have Dr. Andres Patrignani. He is the Associate Professor in Soil Water Processes at the Department of Agronomy at Kansas State University. I've been able to work with Andres even back to his graduate studies, and so I'm excited to have him on the podcast today. Andres, tell the audience a little bit about how you ended up at Kansas State.
Thank you for having me in the podcast. It's a pleasure that you're giving the researchers the opportunity to share what we do. Well, it started with a journey. I was an undergraduate in agronomy back in Argentina. And then all of a sudden there was, I was working for APROSEED, which was the No-Till Farmers Association. And there was the opportunity to do an internship here in the US and say, who wants to go there? And pretty much nobody raised their hand, but I said, okay, I'd like to give that a try. So I ended up in South Dakota, in Brookings. And that was in January. So when I landed here, it was about, 3 feet of snow, minus 30 degrees. And so, okay, I was wondering whether that was a good decision or not. So anyway, I worked there for a year in soil fertility. I really became interested about, pretty much the research that was going on here, but also I was impressed by the amount of resources that were available to researchers. So after that, I started looking for positions in, as a grad student. And then I found Chad Godsey and Tyson Ochsner at Oklahoma State, that they had a project on monitoring, soil moisture using a neutron probe, which is exactly what I was doing at South Dakota State. And so, I spent about 6-7 years doing, master's and a PhD. And after that, there was an opening here at Kansas State University in soil water processes. So it was a pretty good fit. So that's how I landed here. And it's been, I think, 7 or 8 years here at K-State. So.
Man, I can't believe it's been that long, Andres, to be honest. It feels like you were on campus just not too long ago. So share with us, just kind of highlight some of your ongoing research.
So our research program is trying to advance the science of soil moisture sensing. And we are trying to find, new applications for soil moisture information. We work at multiple scales. We go from the undisturbed soil sample scale. We had a new project that just wrapped up on trying to study, soil respiration as a function of soil metric potential and soil moisture content. We had other projects that go at the plot level, where we study, root zone soil moisture in different crop rotations. Then we go to the field level, where we use, a new soil moisture sensing technique called cosmic ray neutron detection, and that allow us to basically monitor field scale soil moisture, and that can be used to match with other instruments like eddy covariance, or it gives you one value for the entire field. And,
so I'm going to go sideways on you. So I'm going to interrupt because you've already piqued my interest in something you're doing and the direction of research that my program's going. The root zone soil moisture. And so for one, tell me, how are you measuring root zone soil moisture?
The traditional method used to be neutron probe moisture meters, but because there are lots of regulations using that, and quite a bit of training and transportation, so we are using two methods. Basically, one is the gravimetric sampling, basically going there with a probe, either handheld or maybe some sort of pneumatic or hydraulic system, where we take undisturbed cores of about 1 meter, or maybe sometimes even 2 meters, about 8 feet, depending on the crop. And then we slice it into different depths. And then we take those slices, we put them in different bags, and we dry them out. And so basically the difference between the wet and the dry mass, it will be the moisture content.
Balance.
Very simple. You can do that in your house in a regular oven. Just ask permission before doing that. And then the other method will be to use some sort of non-invasive sensors like time domain reflectometry or capacitance sensors, and there are new technologies that allow you to basically install an access tube and slide that probe in and out, and it will make the measurements for you. You do have to install some access tubes in the ground for that, for that sensor to go along the entire root zone. But once you do that, you can use that as many times as you want.
So now my follow-up, which is even a more challenging question, at least in my world. How do you know what the root zone is? Is it an active root zone, a theoretical root zone? Where do you know where the root zone actually is?
We don't. Simply
Andres, come on, help me out, brother.
The short answer is that we don't, but we, based on experience, we know what is maybe the typical maximum root length, and then we try to, let's say, but sometimes we don't start monitoring. So, for instance, when you just plant a crop, the crop doesn't have the maximum root length at that time, but we still monitor the entire profile. And what we try to, sometimes you can actually detect that based on the soil moisture water uptake. So if you take readings periodically, let's say every 3 or 4 days or every week, then you can start to see layers of the soil that are drying more than others. And so you can start to infer a little bit where the active root zone is and how that is growing. Without necessarily, excavating the entire, crop.
And this is the method that some of the soil moisture sensors on the marketplace are providing a root depth, right? They're basically looking at the zone which is drying and extrapolating that's the depth of the root.
That will be one way of doing it. At least that will provide a first order approximation. Closer to the surface, you have evaporation. There are other sources of loss. But when you are in the middle of the soil profile or in deeper layers, that can start to give you some insight on where the root water uptake is. But, there are other ways that we can do that, modeling or just, basically looking at the above part of the crop, right?
So, because we've had Dr. Auctioner on before, and we've talked about the cosmic array, and we've talked about the methods to sample we just talked about. Let's kind of dig into, though. I want to know what are we going to do with this data? If you can tell me what the soil moisture is, either on a spatial or temporal time frame, what are the different things that we can do with this data?
The most obvious one will be irrigation scheduling, based on if we can close the soil water balance, or if we know what is the current deficit of the soil, then we can try to compensate that deficit by applying, irrigation. There are other managements that we can do for, like in rain-fed agriculture, although the options are much more limited there. But, for instance, for deciding the timing of nitrogen application, let's say in winter wheat. So if it's in late February and you had to decide whether you want to apply another round of urea to winter wheat, depending on if it's looking good and you have moisture, maybe it's worth applying that nitrogen. And then, but if the crop is not looking good, maybe the forecast doesn't have any rain. Maybe it's not. Maybe you can lower the amount of nitrogen that you want to apply, or maybe you just don't do it. I don't know. So it depends on whether you think it's going to pay for that nitrogen application or not.
So in my world, I love the spatial look. That's what my research goes at, is looking at spatial variance. I'm making an assumption here, but I think it's a safe assumption. I'm going to assume the way a soil holds moisture varies across the landscape. So speak to some of the challenges that you have as a researcher understanding the variance spatially, but then the challenge of just getting it right.
It's hard. So, it's not just the soil type that sometimes changes across the landscape. It's also the micro topography, little undulations here and there, You also have different residue cover, perhaps, or maybe the previous crop, grew a little better in one part of the field than in another. So you already created, or you're carrying some deficit, in different parts of the field. It's the only way that we found to capture that was to grab a handheld soil moisture sensor and go to the field and take, 200, 300 samples, georeference samples or measurements, and basically create a map. And it's very impressive on the amount of variability that you have. So it's good that we set, what is the maximum resolution that we want, because every time, we can end up at the pore scale, right?
Yeah.
And so it's important to set some sort of minimum resolution at which you want to work. And that might be defined by your farming equipment, or might be defined by, what measurement or at what scale you can actually, take action.
That's a great point. Because, the same way with nutrient, right? So we have variability within 2 meters. Significant variability, as you would with water. But we acknowledge that we can't treat every meter effectively, or at least economically right now. What, at least with the Kansas producers that you're working with and have seen, what kind of resolution is currently making sense? It's not 10 years down the road, but right now, what kind of resolution do they really need to be thinking about?
I think the most popular will be at the field level, or at least working in zones. I think that is, I would say, the most popular at this point. Or if someone has a center pivot, they were probably thinking on using maybe different slices of the pie, basically adjusting that. But as we have new technologies like variable irrigation rate, variable seeding rate, then we can start looking at maybe smaller, discrete units in the field. But that will depend on the technology available. And farmers don't change their planter or the irrigation system every year. So maybe when things become obsolete and they have to renew machinery, and that's the time to focus on a newer resolution. I think from my point of view, I think that using management zones seems to be a middle ground between resolution and practicality.
So here's the tough question, because this also now goes to economics. How many measurements? Me, I'm a soil scientist and I do soil sampling, right? So I want 15 to 20 cores per composite. That's not quite logical in any of our soil moisture, at least our current soil moisture sensors, is to have 15. So what number are we looking at? How many data points do we need to have a good concept, even a field scale concept of a good value?
Again, I think that will depend on the spatial variability. So places with more spatial variability will require maybe more samples, or at least I think what we've been finding useful is trying to find some variable that will reveal the spatial variability, something that will tell you without necessarily doing a lot of work, like a high resolution, NDVI image, or maybe some sort of gridded soil sampling that you did, and trying to use some of that information to start telling you. For soil moisture, I don't know, we've taken, it's interesting because sometimes with soil moisture, if it's close to saturation or very dry, you tend to have lower variability. But in the middle, in middle or moderate soil moisture conditions, that's when you tend to have more spatial variability. So different points of the field are drying at different rates, and so that's when you have the maximum variability. So it's not just these management zones or these areas are changing; they are transient, right? So and that actually adds another layer of complexity there.
Varies across space and time, and your time is shorter than even my time in the nutrient side. Well, today we have Dr. Andres Patrignani with Kansas State University. He is the Associate Professor in Soil Water Processes in the Department of Agronomy, and want to kind of switch tracks a little bit. I want to dig into some of the stuff that I think is fascinating as we look at the progression of a career path. So Andres, what really sparked your interest in data? You started in nutrient management, then you went to cropping systems, and then into soil physics. And I look at what you do now, and you've got a lot of data science in what you're doing. So how did you end up into data science?
I think it's the confluence of two little stories. I will try to be brief. One is when I was a kid, my parents bought the first computer for the house, and we didn't have even Windows. So I wanted to play games, and the only way was to use the DOS or the terminal command. And my mother was coming with, I was stopping by a computer store in town and coming with little commands, and basically I was sitting on her lap and trying to write those things to access the games. And actually I wanted to share those with my friends as well. So that's the first time I got exposed to
some of us still remember DOS, Andres. It's okay. You're kind of young for knowing DOS, but my generation knows DOS. So.
But I never then became interested very much in programming. Part of my family was interested or had a farm. And so I went on to agronomy for several years. But when I joined Oklahoma State, I took a grad level class in soil physics theory for understanding how heat, water, and solids move in the soil. We had to learn how to code. That was a good way of bringing these equations, to life. And that's when things clicked. That's when I connected agronomy with coding. It just came natural. And I was able to basically play with them. And so I was not using coding very much for statistical analysis. That was part of my requirement. But I think I was using that just to understand how the natural world around me was working, or at least how we understand it in terms of equations. So, you can tweak a little parameter and you can see how something reacts. You can implement a soil-water balance, and then all of a sudden say, okay, this is cool, but there are also plants in here. So now, okay, how do I include, how plants absorb water? And so now you have a phenology model or a root zone, growth model that we were just discussing. So that's what actually caught my attention, the biophysical aspect, how is that you can put the things that you see on an everyday basis into a computer and see them come to life.
So you're in the Department of Agronomy at K-State, which I'm going to assume has a few students who prefer tractors over computers, prefer being in the field. So how do you teach specifically this group, the group that is probably fairly field heavy, that like that time? I mean, I fight with my own students at times, whether it's statistics or programming. How do you get them interested, and how do you teach students coding and the importance of such?
That's a great question. That was one of the things that I saw as a need when I came here to K-State, and I decided to start teaching a grad level course in scientific programming. But it's for students that have little to no experience in coding. Maybe some of them first time. And the way I do it, I code with them. We go through live coding sessions. We have real world examples with real world data, basically collected by our group or by the Kansas Mesonet. And when I was at Oklahoma State, lots of work with the Oklahoma Mesonet as well. They are great sources of information. They capture spatial variability at a different scale. And so what we do is, I sit down with students. We look at the problems. We try to basically to code together. I think that has been the highlight of that class, and I'm very happy to see that students are at the end of the semester. We just finished last week, and they're crossing the door, and they have really awesome semester projects. They keep coding, and whether it's in the language that I teach or not, it doesn't really matter. I think they need to learn one and then use that language to make the difference. But I think it's a lot about breaking down problems. And so, and that sometimes is not intuitive when you're starting. So it's good to have someone that will help you to point out, how to do some things. And then things become more intuitive. And then, students go on and they keep solving more and more complicated problems on their own.
So share with some of these problems and these questions that these students have been able to ask with your data and the Mesonet data to kind of let our audience know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, so the first one is how to even get the data, right? So some of them need, several years or decades of data. So one of the first things that we do in the class, at least, but after we cover the basics, but is we develop a code to actually pull the data from the Kansas Mesonet And so they actually can specify, what station they want, what dates they want, what variables they want, and then they actually can get the data in their computer. After that, we use the same data that we download and we compute, growing degree days. So we can start having that. And so you start to streamline things. So you don't have to ever leave your environment where you're coding. You get the data, you do the growing degree days, then you can code, let's say, a simple phenology model, or we also do, nitrogen response curve, something that is aligned with people outside of soil physics. So this class is for anyone. And so, we do Proctor test, how to see how the compaction of the soil changes with soil moisture. We do spatial variability of fields by looking at, NDVI images. And I can keep going on. I can put the link there. There is all the content is online. It's called Pi Notes in Agri-Science. And there are over 100 different tutorials, all with agronomy, from a simple rule on how to say whether the pH of the soil is acidic or basic, to more advanced things, all the way to machine learning.
Wow. The way data science is really evolving, and it seems to, at least from my side, who I don't deal with the data science that much, it seems to be an exponential trend. How are you keeping up with the newest and greatest of what's happening?
That's very difficult right now. Everything is very dynamic, and now with the new generative AI, things are becoming very fast paced. So I try to look at I read papers. I think that will be the first one. As a researcher, I want to be to know what's the latest, at least related to agronomy or soil science or crop science. Then there are some interesting, open source projects. There's one called Noom Focus, and that one is basically an organization that supports open source projects for different languages, and that allows me to see what's new out there as well. And then, sometimes, just news feeds or Reddit groups, you can see all sorts of stuff there that, people are basically using and sharing. And just by reading those feeds, it allows you to say, okay, what is that, right? And then you go and check it out and see. And sometimes it's not even aligned with agronomy, but you say, okay, maybe there is an application to agronomy.
That's fantastic. So I guess my last question would be, as you look forward, right, as we move into the next generation of data science and AI, where do you think this is going to evolve as far as field of agronomy and soil science in the next couple of years? What's the next thing? What's the next phase?
Yeah, I think it's automation probably will be the first one to come into place, where we can maybe find, use all the data that we have and the models that we have to let AI create, models that will allow us to have at least some sort of, as a way of having a decision support tool, right? Something that you can say, okay, I have these conditions, this is the forecast, maybe here is an image of the crop, and then you're trying to find out, what is the best course of action based on the data that is given. There are other applications beyond AI, in terms of, data science or coding, which is like a blockchain technology where you can have smart contracts. And so imagine that, there is a drought, and now, that triggers some sort of payments to producers. So there is a lot coming. And from the point of view of research, I think having reproducible research practices is super important, because we have now not just the paper, we have the data, we have the code, so everything has to be shared, not just for the reviewers, but also for the general public to be able to scrutinize and check our work.
All right, Andres, that's interesting. So now as you look, what advice do you have for your colleagues, whether it's a researcher or incoming students who are wanting to improve the reproducibility of their work?
Yeah, so I think it would be good, when we do research, not to sacrifice rigor and reproducibility for, because you're trying to publish, something too quick. So try to do things well. Take your time. Have your code nice and clean. Maybe check it with other people in your team or with your advisor. Well, even for researchers, it's sometimes good to go over and make sure that we are happy about what we're doing. And then, when we can, it would be great to share that in the paper, the data and the code. For people that are just starting out, I would say pick one language and master it. It's not useful to learn multiple languages halfway. So pick one, learn it well, and make the difference with that language. And then also, try to code with other people that have maybe a little more experience, so that how to learn best practices. And then we have generative AI. We've been talking about that. So that's having like a tutor 24/7, right? So that's a great tool for learning. So I think that's some of the things that I would recommend to people just getting started.
It's time for our famous three.
Well, fantastic. Now, as we wrap up, I'm going to hit you with the three questions, and you've already kind of hit this first one, so let's see where you go. But what is your go-to work resource? You're doing a lot of stuff, for everything from soil physics to data science. So what's that go-to resource that you have when you have a question?
Something that I've been using lately a lot are something called Jupyter notebooks. And this is a tool that I use for not just coding, but also for documenting the work that I do. I use it a lot also to not to teach, but also to advise students. We can sit down together and we can see the logic and the workflow. And basically, it's a great way of working together, as a team. And so I think that's something that I've been using lately a lot, and I find them very, very useful, very linear, right? You have to organize your thoughts in a very linear way. I think that's the reason I like it. So
fantastic. So follow up a little bit more fun question. What is your favorite leisurely activity? What do you do in your free time, Andres?
I think I got maybe two in my head. One is I like to take things apart, whether it's something in the lab or the vacuum cleaner at home. It doesn't mean that I can always put them back together, right? But that's one of them. And then the other one, during the pandemic, I came across a rowing machine. So I kind of like to do rowing, just having, listening to a podcast, maybe this podcast. And then, that's something that I started to like, particularly in rainy days like today. You can actually get to work.
Oh, fantastic. All right. And finally, so where do people go to find out more about the work you're doing at Kansas State?
There are a few ways. One will be soilwater.ksu.edu. That's our main page. And then there are others, as I mentioned, PyNotes in agri-science and PyNotes in Google Earth Engine. Those are two websites with a lot of the content that we do in terms of teaching, but much of that content actually came from papers or research projects that have been, published. And so, that's something that we try to do a lot. If we do something in a paper, then, let's teach, people how to do that. It might be, if it was valuable for us, we went through all the hurdles of figuring that out. It might be valuable to other people as well. So.
Fantastic. Beautiful. Well, Andres, thank you so much for joining us on the Crop Science Podcast. Again, this is Dr. Andres Patrignani. He is the Associate Professor in Soil Water Processes, the Department of Agronomy at Kansas State University. And y'all, if you enjoyed what you listened to, make sure you share it with a friend. Even if you don't consider that person a friend, share it anyways. Just get this podcast out there. Hit that subscribe for the channel so that you receive notifications every time we have a new one. Also, leave us any comments you have, suggestions, questions, or even want to see somebody on as a guest. Andres, thank you so much for taking your time today.
Thank you for having me.